Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming in on this, I think, what is officially the first day of spring here in Vermont. We are delighted that you could join us today to explore the art of Harold Weston with esteemed nature writer John Elder and Rebecca Foster, granddaughter of the artist, in conjunction with Harold Weston Freedom in the Wilds, supported in part by D. Wigmore Fine Art. I wanted to quickly run through the logistics of the afternoon before turning the lectern over to Rebecca to introduce John. So if you would join me in silencing, muting, or otherwise quieting any electronic devices you may have so we can all enjoy the conversation without interruption. Thank you. If you're currently a museum member, I wanted to thank you for supporting our work and our connection to community. If you're not a member, we hope that you'll consider joining by the end of today or at another convenient time for you. Just very quickly, if you enjoy the program today, which I know you will, we've got some other upcoming programs in the very near future, including the Shelburne Museum Classic Auto Festival, Trucks, and that's in conjunction with the Vermont Auto Enthusiasts, and that's June 15th and 16th. It's a great way to celebrate Father's Day if you're looking for something to do. And the opening of William Wegman Outside In. Outside In is a comprehensive exhibition exploring over 4 decades of William Wegman's ongoing fascination with the natural world, which ties into what we're talking about today, showcasing over 60 works from the artist's collection in a wide variety of media. And that begins on June 22nd. So, after John's presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, make comments. At approximately 3 o'clock-ish, we'll head downstairs for a revealing tour of the exhibition with Rebecca Foster. There will be a brief 10-minute reset up. So if you'd like to enjoy the other exhibition here in the PCAE Johnny Swing or enjoy the great outdoors, but just for a few minutes, then you can come downstairs and join us at probably approximately 3:10 or 3:15. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Rebecca Foster. Rebecca is the granddaughter of Harold Weston, and along with Rebecca's mother, she manages the artist's estate. She has brought 2 books on Weston to publication: Freedom in the Wilds, An Artist in the Adirondacks, and Wild Exuberance, Harold Weston's Adirondack Art, both of which played a really important role in the exhibition downstairs. Rebecca was also the guest curator of a major retrospective of Weston's work at the Adirondack Museum, now Adirondack Experience in Blue Mountain Lake, New York. She serves as the president of the Society for the Preservation of American Modernists, which supports scholarship in this important field. She's a resident of Charlotte, where she lives with her husband and 2 children. She's the co-chair of the town's energy committee, and we thank her family for serving as the videography crew for today's presentation. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca Foster, who will introduce John Elder.
I should mention that my co-conspirator on that exhibition at the Adirondack Museum is Caroline Welsh, who's right here today. I'm really excited that you could come today. So I grew up with my grandfather's paintings and stories all around me. From the stories came a strong ethical purpose, and from the paintings, a vivid aesthetic. Then 30 years ago, thanks to Bill McKibben's writing, I started to worry about global warming. As my concern intensified over the years, I wondered how to reconcile the emerging grim knowledge with the genuine thrill I got from Harold Weston's story. Was there room to be brutally frank with the world hurtling toward collapse for Weston's work? And yet perhaps it was because of my grandfather's work that I cared at all. Weston's phrase, freedom in the wilds, comes from the idea that we need to protect the wilderness in order to nurture the creative freedom that so exquisitely grows out of it. That idea of freedom in the wilds, coined years before people knew about global warming, feels somehow to me analogous to the current urgency to protect our Earth to save civilization. And I'm not going to lie, it's been hard to reconcile this duality of art and life. And that is why we've invited John Elder here today to sort it all out. And he's in an excellent position to do so. After studying English at Pomona and Yale, he joined the faculty of Middlebury College in 1973. And as a time reference, interestingly, that was about the time when Harold Weston died in 1972. John's interests include American nature writing, English Romanticism, the haiku tradition, Robert Frost's poetry, and the poetry of earth. During the summers teaching at Middlebury's Breadloaf School, he conducted classes on literature and writing, while also hiking and camping with students in Vermont, the Adirondacks, and Alaska. In 2008, he was named Vermont Professor of the Year, a high note to retire on in 2010. John and his wife Rita are both musicians who live in Bristol and are active in local and statewide conservation organizations, including the Vermont Land Trust. John has published widely, both as a scholar of environmental literature and as a writer of personal reflective essays. His books, Reading the Mountains of Home, The Frog Run, and Pilgrimage to Vallombrosa, combine discussions of literature and environmental history. He was co-editor of the Norton Book of Nature Writing, and his most recent book is Picking Up the Flute, a memoir through music. It's been a lot of fun for me to get to know John through preparing for today, and it's exciting to me, having worked for many years on Weston, to know that finally Weston is going to get the distinguished and sensitive John Elder treatment. And I know there are a lot of people in the audience who consider John a kind of literary rock star, so let's give him a rock star welcome.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you, Karen.
You're very welcome.
Oh, thank you for starting my clock, too. Thanks. It's nice to be invited here for this talk. The two books that were mentioned that are on sale here, the collection of essays and images from the Adirondack Museum exhibit, and also the biography of Harold Weston, which is a remarkably lively book, are really worth reading. And Rebecca has had an important hand in both of those. In addition, the film that her husband Kevin Burgett and she did, which is also excellent, is, I understand, suddenly on sale as well. So I recommend all of those to anyone who finds themselves fascinated by Harold Weston, as I have become. My comments today don't come from the kind of, from any expertise comparable to Rebecca's on Weston. So really, I'm thinking of this as an encounter for me with an impressive artist. The more I see of him, the more I admire his work, who speaks to my own focus as a teacher, which has been on the relationship between the literature and art of nature and the evolution of environmental thoughts and values. I've got three goals in this talk. And the first one is to explore a handful of images by Harold Weston with you, as perhaps as a surrogate, as I say, a person discovering an incredible landscape of art and vision. The second is to place Weston's achievements over a very long life of art. He was a highly productive artist for over 50 years. To place it in the context, both of a couple of his important contemporaries, Ansel Adams and Georgia O'Keeffe, and also in the broader sweep of the Romantic rebellion against crass materialism in Western culture, which has continued now for 2.25 centuries. I'll say more about that. By the way, let me pause and say, how's the sound? Is this good? Am I well situated? So, thank you. Okay, I'll forge ahead then. And finally, my goal will be to reflect a little at the end, as Rebecca anticipated, on the pertinence of Weston's paintings to the crisis of climate change in our day. I learned how to teach paintings within a kind of class discussion, having had a background in English, from an art historian named Jules Prown, who said, begin by paying your dues to the canvas. Look at the patterns of light and dark, hot and cold colors, cool colors, geometrical shapes, and from those, interpret the patterns of relationship that evolve. And then once you've paid your dues, feel free to speculate and to bring in associations with other reading and art, with your personal life and with your social context, that if not part of the author's awareness in doing the art, are a big part of how you receive the art. And I think that makes good sense, as long as the difference between those things is clear. And for me, also, as a friend of and a neighbor of Bill McKibben's, I've become increasingly concerned about climate change over the years. The more you learn, the more you realize that the moment is dire. So when we think about natural beauty and health, it's I think appropriate to try to make some connection with the art that celebrates nature's beauty. Harold Weston was born in 1894 to a cultivated family in Marion, Pennsylvania, in part because of his father's inspiration by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who he was able to hear while a student at the Harvard Divinity School. The family spent many summers in the Adirondacks near the so-called philosopher's camp, where people like Emerson and Lowell and Agassiz resorted over numerous summers to think about the meaning of nature and society. And in the generation following the philosopher's camp, a number of idealistic thinkers, educators, and artists continue to go there. And so this was a very formative influence on Harold Weston's growing up. Another influence was that he contracted polio at about the age of 17 and was told that he might never walk again. He did walk again, among other things, and this is very clear in the paintings. He had a ferocious willpower, great energy, and he taught himself to hike through the high peaks with the help of a leg brace. Sometimes he pulled himself up steep trails by holding on to trees, and sometimes he stopped himself careening back down by grabbing the same trees. It was a sort of a high voltage slalom course. I've snowshoed up and down Mount Marcy in several different kinds of weather, and if you're snowshoeing up in the late winter or early spring, when the snow is kind of loose and sliding over a base of ice, I think it must be a little bit like what Harold Weston experienced as a hiker. There's a kind of elevated pulse and a sense of exhilaration that comes with what I would call a sequence of impromptu tree-hugging episodes. And I can see how he might have found a kind of edgy bliss in his own hike, like what I experienced in my own context. Following his graduation from Harvard, he spent a couple of years abroad doing volunteer work during World War II, and then World War I, and then he built a High Peaks cabin near St. Hubert's, where he lived for many years, and where in those first 5 years or so, he produced an amazing body of work, very powerful landscape art, which is well represented in the first section of this exhibition. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to start by looking at three of these early paintings from his first years in St. Hubert's, and look at them together, think about how they work, and do a little interpretation and a little association with them. Now let's see. Okay, here's the first one. It's already up there. It's called Autumn Storm, and it was painted in 1920. So when I look at it, in terms of dark light, hot, cool, the sorts of things Jules Prown asks you to look at, there's certainly a kind of what's the word for it? It's a kind of scattering of dark and light pigment on the and very dark, almost black, very, very pale blue on the canvas. The colors are warm by and large. Purples, reds, rusts, dark, blue, black, plus some fine light blue up in the sky. It's interesting. There's a good little introductory essay in the collection of essays by Theodore Stebbins, who was a well-known American art historian, in which he compared Weston's use of pale blue to its use by Caspar David Friedrich, the German Romantic painter at the beginning of the 19th century, for whom light blue was the color of holiness. It was the color of revelation, and I think it means something similar in Weston. One of the things I was very smitten by Weston. I've spent the last 4 or 5 weeks looking at his paintings and thinking about them, And one of the things that I greatly admire about him is his bold use of color. Specifically, the way in which he combines strong colors, sometimes almost as in that yellow primary colors, right up against other contrasting colors to evoke a kind of tone, a kind of broad complexity of the sort that you'd see on a mountain range. I think it's one of his defining skills, his color sense. So here's another. I'm going to talk about three paintings together. Let's see here. This is called Sunrise from Marcy. And I want to go back because I forgot to say something about the other one. The other thing about this painting that I love is those long arcs of pink cloud above that are concentric with the mountain itself. This is actually a kind of pattern that you see a lot in his early paintings. And what it suggests for me is a kind of relationship between the mountain and the clouds above it, as if they were ripples from the pebble that mountain represents in some pond. They just are radiating out and away, and yet also connecting the earth with the sky. It's a concentric pattern that he's drawn toward, and I'm going to say a little bit more about. And here's the next one. Something fell off my, oh, I see. I won't put it back on, but unless it stops working. Sunrise from Marcy. This is a more panoramic view, but you can see the same kind of pattern of concentric arcs, flat arcs of clouds coming above the more pronounced roundness of the mountain, with many more clouds in the sky. But that same sense of the mountain rising into the clouds, which in turn echo and amplify a kind of charge, like an electric charge given to the sky by those strong forces underneath. One of the things I notice in this painting is, tell me if I wander and you lose my voice. You see how he's outlining some of the mountains in front with dark black? That's very characteristic too, and it's unusual to have that kind of dark black outline around natural forms. For me, it's there's something emphatic, sort of like somebody who underlines in a book. It's underlying the roundness of the mountains, which then gets transferred through the flattening ridge behind it up into the sky. Also, you can see in the front the orange gold glow on top of the foreground mountains, as if there's a flame running across it, or perhaps the sun striking through a line of ridge-top trees. Even behind them, the orange is not carried through, but you can see all the other mountains too have a kind of pale gold outline. This outlining, as I say, it goes along with the kind of emphatic quality in Weston that I really enjoy. Highly emotional, and again, that's something I want to talk about. Rebecca, who is Harold Weston's granddaughter, told me an anecdote that pleased me and that I'd like to share with you in this context. Her father married, obviously, into a highly sophisticated familial conversation about art, and seems not to have been always at the top of the exchange. It was not his main métier, but he was once gazing into a picture of a snowy landscape. I don't know if it was this one. This one is called Giant Mountain from Windy Brow in 1922. He was gazing at that picture, or a picture like it, and he said, in his pictures of snow, there's surprisingly little white, which is true. I mean, even in this one, there if you look closely, there are yellows, there are pinks, there are blues. It's constantly colored throughout. And one of the things that speaks to for me, again, is his great color use. It's whether you call it impressionistic, whether you call it pointilliste, it's something that he loves to do, to try to evoke the feeling by manipulating the colors, which he does with great skill. So here too, of course, you have that concentric pattern. You have the almost scalloped clouds in yellow above this dramatic snowy brow. And it has that same feeling of something being continued. For me, perhaps given the winter setting, and also given that special little ornamentation in the scalloping of the lights, it almost suggests a kind of nativity scene. Something is happening. Something spectacular is happening in the world. It's extraordinary. Now, the other thing to say about this color, before moving on from these three concentric images, is that it's also simply realistic. If you live in a northerly latitude like this, and you have fields of snow, and you look closely, you'll notice that the snow is always saturated with color and changing. In the morning, it's yellow. At noon, it's golden. At twilight, it's pink, and as night comes on, it's blue. That's the story of snow in our landscape. It's the beauty of it, and that's something that kind of prismatic shift that his art makes available. Now, so here's a pattern that these three images share. Let me think about them a little bit in that sort of interpretive phase of Proun's approach to reading a painting. I think there's a haloed sense to these concentric skies in all three paintings, and that it expresses Harold Weston's own sense of the high peaks as both beautiful and sacred. Through his long residence at St. Hubert's, he was sometimes called the Thoreau of the Adirondacks, but actually, I think his true affinity in these early images is with Emerson. Emerson, for one thing, loves concentric images, and I'll look at that from time to time. But just to start, in his defining book Nature, which was one of the biggest single influences on American landscape painting in the 19th and 20th centuries, Emerson began with a little epigraph. I'll just tell you what the first four verses of the epigraph were. A subtle chain of countless rings, the next unto the farthest brings. The eye reads omens where it goes, and speaks all languages, the rose. This sense of rings that both connect and define and communicate with each other gives you a feeling that the landscape is both exalting, expansive, and deeply familiar. Everything is connected from the human scale out to the cosmic. This sense of nature as at once a grand physical fact and a spiritual revelation, I think, is conveyed really memorably in the first chapter of Emerson's Nature, which is, for me, a kind of essential background for Weston's early landscape painting. I'll just quote a little bit from Emerson. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. I've always felt that transparent eyeball is one of the weirdest images possible, and it's also got a kind of disembodied abstraction that I think Weston will be moving away from. Emerson, too, by and by. Harold Weston's sense of the Adirondacks is both intimate and transcendent. Relates to an informal survey I used to carry out with my Middlebury students over many years. Regardless of their religious backgrounds or lack of background, they very often said that their strongest perceptions of the sacred came out of doors, whether in sublime settings like the high mountains or the ocean, or in the saturated colors of sunrise, twilight, or northern lights. And this has been my experience too. This is an experience, I think, that is so common today, it makes these early exuberant paintings of Weston's still highly current. The way he feels and the way he expresses and conveys his feelings still speaks to many people's religious experiences. Now, let me look more briefly at a couple of other of his early paintings. Here's one called Clouds, Upper Ausable Lake, another painting from 1922. Oh, I should tell you, Rebecca will tell us more about this in the gallery talk, but in one of his early shows, he made all of his own frames. He carved them and gilded them. He's the man who seems to have had lots of energy. And they tend to be distinct from painting to painting, fit into the paintings, and I think they're beautiful. I mean, they have that, it's an interesting kind of Adirondack craftsman touch that goes that goes along with their origins, but this is one of those. Here again, there are concentric ripples in the water and of off Sable Lake and in the sky. Interestingly, these ripples seem to be emanating in different sources, different pebbles, as it were. And for me, at least, I would take that as a kind of token of the fact that he's moving from a purely transparent eyeball to a little bit more something occluded and complicated with the origins of energy in more than one place at once. And here's another one where something similar is happening. Again, you get that sense of the earth energy transfiguring the sky, although not within that orderly concentric pattern in the first ones we looked at. These waving, interwoven clouds reminded me of both the aurora borealis and a phenomenon in the Sierra with fine powder blown off conical peaks that John Muir in the mountains of California calls snow banners. Muir writes, "They stream perfectly free all the way across intervening notches and passes from peak to peak, while others overlap and partly hide each other." I value these complications of the simply concentric and also a kind of making opaque what Emerson presented as transparent. It's a sense of the physical and the spiritual energies crossing and weaving and complicating and coloring each other throughout creation, with the human perspective and our occasional experiences of Emersonian transparency continually complicated but also regrounded. Weston was an interesting painter because he was so determined not to get stuck in a little box. Early on, people, I just found out, a French reviewer and then an American compared him with Van Gogh, and you can see why with those strong colors right next to each other and sometimes thickly applied. He hated the thought of being always in a Van Gogh box, and in fact he was always looking for a way to get outside of any box at all. But the fact is that reverberation and the concentric was an emphasis that went all the way through his first years, and that got more and more complicated as he went along, and more solidified and personal. Now, one thing to say about all five of these paintings we've just glanced at is that they convey landscape and the sky as together forming a sublime reality. And the word sublime is a key word for that romantic tradition that finally I want to argue is one place to put Harold Weston, and one way to understand the way we feel about nature in America today. So just a word about sublime first. It's a funny word. It comes from the Latin, and the etymology is sub, which means under, as you know, and limen, which means the lintel of a door. And the way you translate sublimen in Latin is right up to the top of the door. The sublime is the biggest aesthetic and psychological effect that can come through the door. You know, Bolshoi. It's just the biggest. It's a perceptive category of overwhelming size, and the way to think about that has prevailed and influenced the Romantic writers was stated through Edmund Burke in his 1757 treatise on aesthetics, which is called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas on the Sublime and the Beautiful. And in it, he looks at a certain kind of natural and artistic experience that's vast, as simultaneously annihilating, like reading King Lear or the Book of Job, and positively, destructive to our life if we're caught in a blizzard at the top of a ridge. But at the same time, liberating. We feel annihilated because we're so small compared with the biggest forces of nature. But we also feel as nature expands beyond the usual way we've thought of it as real estate, there's a bigger world for us to live and move and have our breathing in. This is the overwhelming aspect of a certain kind of natural experience. Here's what Burke wrote, summing this up. He said, "The passion caused by the great and the sublime in nature, when those causes operate most powerfully, is astonishment. Just astonishment. It's like natural awe. We're rocked back. We're removed from our sort of daily habits of getting and spending. We're left face to face with the mystery of the cosmos. And it has ethical implications, the sublime. If you really perceive with astonishment the beauty of nature, you're less likely to look at it, as Gary Snyder said in one of his essays, as just a warehouse of raw materials from which we humans can make our products. It's a living sphere in which we're included. It's a mystery. It's a swirl. Well, as I've said, I think that you can talk about Weston in terms of Emerson. You can talk about him, as I'm going to do pretty soon, in relation to some other contemporaries of his. But finally, I want to place him in the Romantic movement. The Romantic movement, which began in the late 18th century and whose English originator really in lots of ways was William Wordsworth. Wordsworth was the inspirer of Emerson and also of Thoreau. And here's a passage from his prelude that speaks to these scenes of Weston we've just been looking at. It describes when Wordsworth and his companion goes over the ridge of the Alps and is going back down a gorge in a river below Mont Blanc. The immeasurable height of woods decaying, never to be decayed. The stationary blasts of waterfalls. And in the narrow rent at every turn, winds, thwarting winds, bewildered and forlorn, the torrents shooting from the clear blue sky, the rocks that muttered close upon our ears, black drizzling crags that spake by the wayside as if a voice were in them. The sick sight and giddy prospect of the raving stream, the unfettered clouds and region of the heavens, tumult and peace, the darkness and the light were all like workings of one mind, the features of the same face, blossoms upon one tree, characters of the great apocalypse, the types and symbols of eternity of first and last, and midst and without end. It's obviously essentially Romantic language, alpha and omega, before and after, the one mind, the features of nature being like the features of a single face. You know, I thought of this passage from Wordsworth when reading the following description from Weston's really vivid autobiography, Freedom in the Wild. Here's what he writes about how it felt to be in such landscapes painting his paintings. And he painted fast and he painted so emotionally sometimes he became ill from the nervous strain. The tempo of the moving clouds calmed down after a while, and it cleared as we watched the movement of sun patches and shadows sweep up and over the bare, glistening sides of the western ridge of Gothics, with the giant mountain in the distance now benignly warming up in sunlight. I did 4 paintings in a frenzy. The wild exuberance of the day and its successive orgasms of wilderness beauty called for a shorthand method in paint to capture rapidly changing emotional reactions, methods that predated abstract expressionism. It was indeed a morning of glory. His phrasing in this description may reflect the fact that he wrote it in October of 1923 after his marriage to Faith Borton in the previous May. He said that in his first year of living in the cabin in St. Hubert alone, and he was quoting him again, a semi-pantheism permeated my reactions, the tree, cloud, mountain, life and the eternal seen through the incandescence of the moment. That's a great definition of the sublime. The second year, I started painting somewhat larger oils in the studio, and not directly from nature, but based on my knowledge and love of nature and expressed in somewhat stylized forms. Perhaps, I'm thinking that's the end of his quotation, I'm thinking that by semi-pantheism, he might mean something like what the Greeks, well, say like Plotinus called panentheism. And what they meant by panentheism was, it's not that there's a particular God in a particular tree or rock. God is suffused throughout nature. That's what Plotinus meant by panentheism. And it seems to me that's more like what we're getting. Maybe that's how I interpret semi-pantheism in these earlier canvases of Weston's. I've already talked about or noted his desire to keep pushing outward from the styles that he had mastered so that he didn't get stuck. Rebecca Foster has written, his was a condition of continual experimentation by disposition and professional resolve. If you stop to watch yourself performing, he wrote, you won't get beyond your mirrored self. That's pretty interesting. It reminds me of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a philosopher who's also been a big influence on 20th century art, whose essential distinction was between seeing something as something, assigning it to a perceptual category, and seeing something in itself, in its freshness, its immediacy, its bewildering strangeness. So, for Weston, you can see the evolution of his art so clearly, just as in these clouds. He wanted to move to what he called the stylized, to express some of his philosophical as well as the earlier emotional impulses. Here's oops, got it upside down, so I went backwards. Tried. Yeah. Oh, I actually was going to talk about this first, and I will. This is Ansel Adams. It's called Half Dome Thundercloud. I wanted to bring it in because it seems to me it's from the same emotional universe as all of those mirroring clouds. The clouds expressing something that is also the landform. Above the millions of tons of granite in Half Dome, you've got this kind of swirl of water vapor, constantly reforming and yet obviously aligning above the mountain itself. It's a sense of a continuity between earth and sky, between matter and spirit, that is essential to this kind of glory that's what both Adams and Weston are after. It's interesting, both of them were influenced by the great photographer Alfred Stieglitz. Both of them were influenced by Emerson. And you can see a kind of lineage. Adams was born in 1902, so just a slightly younger contemporary of Weston's. But now I wanted to go on to this one. This is called Birch Tree. It's from that same early period, and it's interesting because it seems to me this really is stylized. It's moved further from the treatments of mountains and clouds in that first one, and the tree itself is just a swirl of golden energy. It's expressed with a real directness. The natural form is transfigured into this emanation of energy. Now, moving ahead into his next phase, I want to look at a few pictures that are not represented in the exhibit here. We mostly have a wonderful little collection from these early landscapes, which I adore, and then some also extremely interesting paintings from the end, from something called the Stone Series. But in the middle, Harold Weston did what he called his landscape nudes. And these are related to the fact that he got married, which is, as I say, the earlier passage reminded me of that fact too. Here's something he says in his autobiography. Marriage brought the nude into my life and pantheism disappeared. I have a little exclamation point in my margin of the book at that point. My wife had a beautiful body and I wanted to express and paint some of the deep emotions it aroused in me. When the winter snows set in and we were entirely alone at St. Hubert's the first 2 years after we were married, I began doing a series of nudes and fragments of nudes. There was no fear of interruption. We had no telephone. The companionship of working together under conditions of primitive living and almost complete isolation brought about an exceptional quality of togetherness that has endured through nearly 50 years. And in fact, his references to his marriage with Faith Borton are so passionate, and his sense of their marriage so remarkable, it makes me sorry I never had a chance to talk with her. She lived a couple of decades later than he did, and seems to have also been a very remarkable person. But it's interesting, clearly, the passion of their life and their isolation together. Now this is interesting. This got truncated somehow. Well, anyway, it's a beautiful picture. This is called Headland. The pictures that emerge from the nude landscape aspect of his career, I think, really tie together the beginning and the end in in some beautiful ways. It shows him switching his emphasis for the mountain ridges to, at this point, the body of his wife as she lies on her stomach, and that sort of clever title headland. She's both a landscape, and her head is, one of the major forms in it. But he's working the flesh with that same thick overlay of pigments that we've seen already in the mountains. This is a beautiful portrait, I think, in which the way he works the colors so thickly gives you a sense of solidity, of three-dimensional tone. To me, it also suggests how her back might have appeared under the ruddy glow of an oil lamp in their cabin. He's not depicting an ideal of ethereal beauty. It's the solidity and complexity of a human body as a physical form, like a landform. These landscape nudes, for me, are some of his greatest achievements. Here's another one, perhaps my favorite of all. It's called Torso. We're changing in the proportion here somehow from here to here, but that's okay. What you can see is that he's truncated. What you get here, although the has it really been? No, it's my angle. It's okay. But it's truncated. Her head is not showing. Her legs only down to the knees, and outlined strongly in ways that make them feel like landforms. In fact, when I see how her hip comes down and then her shoulder comes in down to the breast, behind it from her waist or her back, it's like receding hills. Going back in that second image we look to, it's very absorbing. This picture again with the strong black lines, which make secondary landforms come out along the way. These two paintings make me think of his contemporary Georgia O'Keeffe, and it's interesting to look at them, I think, in what it tells you further about his paintings. She, too, was inspired by O'Keeffe, and also her life was directly affected by O'Keeffe because he was her husband, and he, with his photograph, as Weston did, very often depicted his wife in nude studies that had a kind of abstract interest. The interesting thing, though, about it is that she herself began to paint similar, you might call landscape nudes, when she moved out to northern New Mexico. I agree with Foster's judgment that, and this is quoting her, unlike pretty nudes displayed for the male gaze, these were something more about the woman herself. But still, it's satisfying in thinking about Weston to balance his inevitably male perspectives with paintings in which a female gaze, too, encounters the world's body. And actually that relates to my sense of, at the end, of where nature art will go. So in turning to the landscape nude, Weston was moving past Emerson's abstract celebration of the transparent eyeball, that's for sure. He was going into a world of relationship between the human body and the world's body. This was a personalization. It was an erotic charge that factored human mortality, human desire, into the erosive passage of time and space and geological forces through the record of Earth's history. Now, it's interesting to look at her Red Hills and Gray Sky, that's called. For me, just as you can look at the body of Faith depicted in that earlier landscape, and I'm glad that actually it's not foreshortened as it was from my angle. From here, when I look at those hills, I see a woman lying on her side, or at least that's one of the things I see, with her arm going down across what might almost look like her face. With that, it's not an exact correspondence and it's not a realistic portrait, but there's a kind of evocation of a secondary landscape that informs the first. It's very powerful as she paints what for her is the bodily essence of the landscape. Here's another one that I think helps us go further with this conversation. This is called Red Hills and Bones. So in the front you've got a cow's spine and maybe a leg bone there. Then you've got the white blossoms of creosote bushes down along the one little hill and in the wash. And then behind that, you've got a kind of very pale band in the hills where some limestone deposition from long ground-up shells on an ancient coastline has been deposited. For me, and again, this is speculative. I'm just playing around with this, not saying it's how O'Keeffe looked at it, but just what it brings to me. For me, the bones and the flowers, which are so much have so much shorter in existence than any of the other things in the picture, and then the band of deposition brings time into the space. We live in time as well as in space. Our mortality is related to the desire that also informs those new landscapes. To recognize that we both, like the cattle and the flowers, emerge from the earth and go back into the earth, like the experience of the sublime, has ethical implications. We are not visiting from some other planet. This is our home. It's our mother, that old trope that nevertheless, that's where we're born, it's where we go. It's our final destination, and it requires, it deserves a kind of carefulness as opposed to a ravage and waste approach as too often been the case. Just thinking about this a little longer, here's one more picture. This is another landscape nude. It's called Seated Back Nude, 1932. Very dramatic. Again, you can see the way he's modeling the flesh like mountains. You can also, it seems to me, he really emphasizes the spine and the ribs. You see the skeleton within the flesh, and that too, for me, among other things, emphasizes the fact that the body is like those sublime and eroded forms of exposed rock. It's got a longer history. Parts of it will survive when other parts of it are gone. It has a kind of pathos, which again, for me, encourages respect and gravity in the way we treat nature. Here's a speculative comparison for what it's worth. This is going back again. This is called Forest Winter back in 1922, that amazing year in Western's painting. The reason I just brought this in is it reminds me of a painting like Torso. Look at that tree. It's modeled. It's got that reddish tone treated so thickly to bring out the solidity and the roundness of it, and it's outlined with thick black lines. Like, look at this. It just pops out of the painting, and it looks like flesh, as George O'Keeffe's landmarks did. It's just like a revelation on a different scale than those first revelations that we looked at. It makes us see the earth and all the other creatures and entities that share it with us as having form, solidity, and texture, as being real, and as we are, alive. Now, it's interesting that before moving away from this whole O'Keeffe thing, which obviously interests me, I'm getting a little disproportionate here, but I can't help myself. Before moving away from it, I would just like to look back at some of his other pictures that help you to believe in this kind of affinity with O'Keeffe. Here's one. I'll just look at him quickly. This is called Gothics from Sawtooth. Having just been looking at George O'Keeffe, we can see an affinity here, right? Look at the flesh of that mountain and the erosions of it and the different limbs folded in. Or look at this one. It's called Toward Evening. It's downstairs. The same thing. I find it an amazing connection with O'Keeffe. One difference is those black lines. She doesn't do that. But she does in other ways emphasize the seams and the folds where water has run and where extrusion and compression have happened. So again, this is an astounding aspect for me of Weston's work. I wouldn't have expected it from the very earliest landscapes. There's a kind of erotic heat, a kind of bodily understanding of the world that's essential to it. This makes it all the more surprising when at the end of his life, he takes on another project called the Stone Series, and that's also well represented downstairs. This was a set of paintings that he painted on almost up till his death in 1972, and it has a remarkably cool palette. In 1968, he was shown a collection of stones collected by Faith's brother John Borton and his wife Polly in Quebec. Foster describes these smooth stones as coming from a beach on the St. Lawrence River and as having, and this is her language, an infinite variety of pattern in their white veins. Here's what they look like. Here's a photograph of those stones. They are pretty amazing. They have all these circles on them, right? I guess the circles come when a block of stone is eroded. I'm thinking it's a little bit like what happens when you have quarter sawn oak, going through one set of lines, and you get a kind of efflorescence of curves, and so these stones really grabbed him. In fact, they brought them to show him the stones, and according to Foster, he said, "You have to give them to me. I need them." My words, not his, but that's how I took it. So he did keep them, and he made a number of paintings of them. They are so different in a way, these paintings, from what he started with. This is called Conference. It was painted in 1968. And it's kind of a witty title for me. It's kind of like Headland. These stones that are leaning together as if they put their heads together, for a little confab. One of the differences I find between this last series, the stone series, and the others is, look at the surface of the color. It's much less labored. I mean, it's still modulated, but it's a smoother surface. The whole painting has more of a, to me, a two-dimensional aspect, a little bit more like fabric. But having said that, and having noticed these weird and interesting lines that he's inspired to do from the stones, I would just note, though not in black, these stones too are outlined. That in a kind of pumpkin color down here, a kind of gray-green over there. So they're outlined. Again, he's saying, look at them. And also, in addition to that comparison, in the background, behind these cool tones, so much cooler than his earlier palette, you have clouds rising up over the horizon, embracing it, with a sense that anything we see before us is echoed and extended out into the universe. So it's an interesting way in which he's gone so far in his evolution, and yet there's something characteristic that continues. Two more pictures. This is called Tibetan Dawn. I love it, and it looks abstract, but if you look back at the photographs, so there are the spirals and the circles of the stones themselves. That big one on the right has, to my eye, some of the very same patterns that he showed. So it's a different kind of realism. So this beautiful design, Tibetan Dawn, which he did in 1969, as I say, part of it is a transcription of lines from one of the stones, but it also recalls something we looked at before, the sense of circularity in Emerson. I think Emerson, just as Emerson starts out, Emerson comes around at the end as well. He wrote an essay much later than Nature called Circles, and I'll read just a little bit of it because it speaks, I think, so strongly to Weston's intent. The eye is the first circle. This is Emerson. The horizon which it forms is the second. And throughout nature, this primary figure is repeated without end. It is the highest emblem in the cipher of the world. St. Augustine described the nature of God as a circle whose center was everywhere and its circumference nowhere. We are all our lifetime reading the copious sense of this first of forms. Our life is an apprentice to the truth that around every circle another can be drawn, that there is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning, that there is always another dawn risen on mid-noon, and under every deep a lower deep opens. I think from the first to the last of Weston's art, there is this circle whose center is everywhere. And in moving from the early landscapes to the landscape nudes, he complements that Emersonian abstraction with, as I've said, a kind of erotic, fleshly vision that makes the love of nature more human, more desirable, that's more motivating, rather than simply being a transcendental spectacle. And I think there's a similar valuable complementarity when he moves to the stone series. It recaptures the grand perspective of something in nature that's beyond our human scale and power, but it does so in a cool microcosm. These images of stones recalls for me something that the art critic Kay Larson once wrote about John Cage, with his insistence that all sounds are music to a receptive ear. The whole universe blazes, she wrote, the whole universe blazes with the compounded energy of relationship in what John Cage called the interpenetration of unlimited centers. Here's the last image I want to look at. This is called Updraft. It's one of his very last paintings. And in it, he echoes the cradling clouds, on the top of that 1920 painting, Autumn Storm, with which we began. Also, the bending of limbs beside that incredibly robust trunk in forest winter trees, and also the mysterious floating lines in these stones from a beach on the St. Lawrence River. From first to last, he celebrated nature's holy beauty, even as he warmed it through human sexuality in the nude landscape and cooled it in his final portraits and transcriptions of water-rounded stones. Now, just a couple of things about climate change and my sense of the context, because I'm in love with Weston's paintings, and I really am grateful for them. But I think, as I said in the beginning, it's important to acknowledge that nature, as we've known it, is challenged fundamentally by the realities of climate change. We have to bring that into our discussion of natural beauty and art. Bill McKibben, who is the leading climate writer and activist, I think, of our day, has emphasized the art's necessary role. Here's what he wrote, and it's been my little koan I've been carrying around with me for years now. He says, artists are the antibodies of the cultural bloodstream. He describes them as being antibodies that arise when art, both of great worth and in great quantities, begins to cluster around an issue. That means that civilization has identified it finally as a threat. So there's a creative efflorescence that art needs to provide for us, and yet it's also developing this world of environmental art simultaneously with the momentum of crass materialism and consumerism. The way I look at the Romantic movement is that actually beginning with Wordsworth and Emerson and coming up through O'Keeffe, also Van Gogh, Weston, Adams, there's been a continuing struggle from the end of the 18th century, pitting a world of emotion, the beauty of nature, the preciousness of rural communities, and the cultural values often undervalued as feminine against the rationalistic, hierarchical, mechanistic, and exploitive values of modernity. That's the fight. It's been going on. I think that sums up the last 2 centuries of Western civilization. But even as these values have gained traction and produced amazing art and amazing literature, and led to, in our own time, to abolitionism, suffrage, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, these are all part of the Romantic Revolution. The momentum of a fossil fuel-based economy and of our consumerist culture has also barreled along. There's an amazing collision. So I think as we rejoice in Harold Weston's art, we also need to register the fact that the alpine flora atop Mount Marcy, like that atop Mount Mansfield, is in grave danger of disappearing. We need to know that the graceful hemlocks along those Adirondack streams and beside the ponds, there and in our state as well, are also in danger of being eliminated. So the temptations, given those two powerful realities, are either to celebrate the art and ignore the ecological crisis, or to acknowledge defeat. I don't know how many people have seen Bill McKibben's new book, 2019, called Falter, and the subtitle is, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? It's the gravest of Bill's evocations of the problems we're facing. It's harrowing indeed. But it also ends with him exploring where hope might lie. So I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs from the end of Bill's book and then to say just a short word more. He concludes like this. This is the way his book ends. So I should say spoiler alert, but I do not know that we will make the choices we need to make. I rather suspect we won't. We are faltering now, and the human game has indeed begun to play itself out. That's what the relentless rise in temperature tells us, and the fact that we increasingly spend our days staring glumly at the rectangle in our palm. But we could make those choices. We have the tools to allow us to stand up to the powerful and the reckless, and we have the fundamental idea of human solidarity that we could take as our guide. We are messy creatures, often selfish, prone to short-sightedness, susceptible to greed. In a Trumpian moment with racism and nationalism resurgent, you could argue that our disappearance would be no great loss. And yet most of us, most of the time, are pretty wonderful, funny and kind. Another name for human solidarity is love, and when I think about our love, our world in its present form, that is what overwhelms me. The human love that works to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, the love that comes together in defense of sea turtles and sea ice and all else around us that is good, the love that lets each of us see we're not the most important thing in the world, on earth, and makes us okay with that. The love that welcomes us, imperfect, into the world and surrounds us when we die. I would just say in closing, at the heart of Weston's art, for me, at every stage of its progression, is the centrality of love. In the midst of our current roller coaster of loss, that may be our best way forward. As like him, we do our best to broaden our understanding of what love means, to broaden it, to personalize it, to find it more motivating. Society's inability to deal more decisively with climate change when we had a chance assures that there will be enormous, palpable loss within our beloved landscapes. But the impulse to connect earth with sky, art with policy, and grief with celebration will remain our truest path forward. Here in Vermont, artists like Cammie Davis and musicians like Sam Guarnacha are recalling us to the beauty and preciousness that continues to surround us, from the high peaks to the stones beside the Winooski River. Conservation and consolation are both strengthened by the freshness of an art rooted in the freshness of nature. Thank you. Well, thank you. And I would love to hear comments or questions or anything you'd like to say. It would be great to have a little chance for conversation here before we move to the gallery talk. Anybody have something they'd like to say or ask?
I think there's, just a couple of things that really struck me that are similar to what you were saying, but are not long. I think that better? Okay. I think a few things that strike me is that there's this incredible push-pull from top to bottom in Weston's work all the time, and that there is an intensity between earth and life. I think between the fact that earth is animate for Weston, and it's animate in his eye, it's animate in his line, and he's kind of synthesizing almost in a yin-yang way.
Yes.
Warm and cool.
Yes.
And positive and negative.
That's very helpful. Now, I like this as a push-pull and also that electrical image of positive, complete the circuit so that the energy can flow. I've talked, I brought in the landscape news to talk about the erotic side of it. An image that came out of D.H. Lawrence in his novel The Rainbow was that when people are able through their bodily experience of sexual passion to reconnect with the earth, it's like a rainbow with its foot standing down on the ground again. A circuit has been closed that otherwise in our mechanistic, industrial, materialistic social contexts can leave people forlorn and isolated. But so art is trying to do this too. Please, other comments or questions, I'd welcome them. Anybody have, please, over here we go.
As I look at the paintings, I notice that many of them seem like an expanded spring, and I feel like that implies some of the energy that Weston was trying to express about the landscapes or the figurative landscapes, that they're sort of wound with an energy that's beyond the visual.
That's a lovely, so like this would be one where you get that sense of expanded spring.
Yeah.
Tendrils and little shoots.
Many of the other landscapes had arches that sort of connected in a cascading manner that sort of implied something that was stretched.
Yes. There was a passage that I didn't bring into this talk because I brought in plenty as it was, but where it was talking about the fact that power moves through the world. and it moves through the tiniest seed. You know, there's something about spring where all that potential begins to spread and the tendrils to rise. It's a sense of hope. And you know, I was thinking, in terms of what I said at the end, that sense of love or of the erotic, you know, the poets have spoken so much better about that. Dylan Thomas talks about the force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my red blood. You know, that there's power, even in the face of natural destruction, there's power that can rise into something. It can rise up. Or another poet, Wendell Berry, at the beginning of one of his poems, he says, "When despair for the world grows in me and I wake in the night the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives would be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in its beauty and the water where the great heron feeds." You know, that just much is lost, but much remains, and much has the potential to arise again. It feels. This is not an argument, but it's an observation and it's a feeling. It's where hope may lay, because we're going to be on quite a ride now. There's no way. We bought our ticket. The question is how we can continue to affirm and to look with love on our world. Any other? These have been such wonderful comments. Any other comments or questions, please?
I was wondering if you could.
I need to be over here. Yeah, I'm wayward.
Could you color in the context of the Adirondacks in the 20s and 30s? So what was going on there in terms of the natural environment and the human environment?
You know, there'll be people here who can do that better than I would say that, but I'll just say the efforts to conserve the Adirondacks go back a long way, and they've always been in contention. And so different forms of the Adirondack Trail Network and the Adirondack wilderness. But would somebody who's from the Adirondacks and knows this well talk a little bit about what the state of play? I know we have several people here who could do it in the 20s. And Carolyn, is that something you could talk about? It's a great question, and we'll get you a good answer to it now.
Well, interestingly enough, your reference to exploitation brought about the conservation and preservation in the terms of creating the Forest Preserve in 1885 and the Adirondack Park in 1892. By 1920, logging was going pretty full bore, and logging had become mechanized by 1920, so it was no longer carried out with a horse, but the horse was still present in the woods, but a chainsaw was being introduced towards the end of the 20s, and trucks were beginning to be able to haul out hardwood in addition to softwood, which could float. So, but where Weston was in the middle of one of the great preserves that had been set aside and by earlier members of the family, correct, Rebecca? And so that was a little, I don't think he was seeing rapacious logging and other effects of industrialization in his particular part.
What about the context of New York wealth, moving?
Well, New York wealth came to the Adirondacks as a playground, and but there was always and the other thing that was happening that really got in the height of it was the conservation of the human being in terms of the treatment of tuberculosis in Saranac Lake. So that's another interesting positive side of conservation. But what was the other part of your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering to what extent was Weston part of that movement in camps into the lakes and the Adirondacks, and on the one hand it was developing unspoiled places, and on the other a powerful force of conservation.
And his family and many of the people who came to the Osebo Club were very strong proponents of conservation.
Great, thank you. And we have another comment here, and then, did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that the Osebo Club was finally performed officially in 1911. And it was by a group of wealthy New Yorkers although they had a very conservationist bent, but they were part of the many groups that that used the Adirondacks as a playground.
Yes. Let's have one more comment, and then I better round off so there'll be time for the gallery walk, please.
I think there was a famous story of Teddy Roosevelt, who was climbing the Adirondacks. At the time he got word of that he had become president, that the president had passed. And he was a great outdoorsman and a great conservationist, and he rushed back to Washington, and he was the one who started the national park. So this had not just local, but national implications.
Yes. So, and to round up those last several very, very interesting comments, it makes me think of the push-pull, in his images from the top and the bottom. There's a kind of tension that we're facing, an extreme tension that might have outgrowths of strong insight, it seems to me, and powerful art. That's the hope. Okay. Well, thanks very much again.